Hey guys, tonight, we begin a journey that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about royalty. What if I told you that the most beautiful queens in history, the women we admire in paintings and movies, rarely bathed? What if the very same hands that signed treaties and wore million-dollar jewels were crawling with lice? And here's Stekkiger. What if their breath was so foul that courtiers had to stand several feet away during conversations? I know it sounds impossible. After all, we've been fed this fairy tale image of pristine princesses and glamorous queens our entire lives. But tonight, I'm going to pull back the velvet curtain and show you the shocking, disgusting, and sometimes deadly truth about royal hygiene. We're talking about practices so revolting that they would make a modern teenager's messy room look like a medical facility. Picture this. Queen Elizabeth I, arguably one of history's most powerful women, had teeth so black and rotting that foreign ambassadors wrote home in horror. Marie Antoinette's legendary hair was so filthy and infested that servants had to use special tools just to get near her scalp. And don't even get me started on what royal women did during their monthly cycles. It's worse than your worst nightmare. So, before we dive deeper into these royal secrets together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if you're genuinely curious about the wild truths I'm about to share. And hey, I'm always curious. Where are you watching from tonight? Your bedroom? Living room? Maybe you're already under those cozy blankets. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover these shocking royal secrets that history tried to hide. You see, there's this misconception that's been floating around for centuries. We look at those gorgeous oil paintings hanging in museums. You know, the ones where queens look absolutely radiant with porcelain skin and elaborate gowns, and we assume they lived lives of luxury and cleanliness. Hollywood has only made this worse. Every period drama shows us these perfectly groomed royal women who seem to have stepped out of a modern spa. But here's what they don't tell you in those movies. Here's what those portrait artists conveniently left out. The reality behind palace walls was so shocking that if you transported any of these royal women to modern times, they'd probably be refused service aid to a local McDonald's due to health code violations. Let me paint you a different picture. Imagine walking into Versailles during its golden age. The halls are magnificent, covered in gold and crystal chandeliers that cost more than entire villages. But then you catch a whiff of something wrong. It's not just one smell. It's layers upon layers of human filth, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and things I probably shouldn't mention while you're trying to relax. The truth is, royalty lived by completely different rules when it came to personal hygiene. And I'm not talking about minor differences. I'm talking about practices that would horrify a modern 5-year-old. We're going to explore 10 specific hygiene disasters that were not only common, but actually considered normal, even fashionable among the most powerful women in history. Tonight, we'll discover why Queen Isabella of Spain was actually proud of only bathing twice in her entire lifetime. We'll learn about deadly makeup that literally poisoned queens from the inside out. We'll explore the medieval belief that water was dangerous to human health and how this led to some of the most disgusting beauty routines you could imagine. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating and slightly terrifying. These women weren't just random people making bad choices. They were the trendsetters of their time. Whatever they did, thousands of other noble women copied. Their disgusting habits became the gold standard of high society. Their poor hygiene wasn't seen as gross. It was seen as sophisticated, refined, and worthy of imitation. And the crazy part, some of these practices were so embedded in royal culture that they lasted for centuries. We're talking about hygiene disasters that were passed down from mother to daughter, from queen to princess, like precious family heirlooms. Except instead of jewels or crowns, they were passing down lice, disease, and some seriously questionable choices. As we journey through these 10 shocking practices together, you'll start to understand how the pressure to maintain royal appearances led to some of the most counterproductive and dangerous beauty routines in human history. You'll see how the pursuit of status and elegance somehow resulted in the exact opposite: disease, disfigurement, and in so many tragic cases, death. But don't worry, this isn't just going to be 2 hours off grossing you out, though I'll definitely do some of that. This is a story about human nature, about how social pressure can make us do the most irrational things, and about how far people will go to fit in with their peers. It's about the gap between public image and private reality, a gap that was never wider than it was in royal palaces. So get ready, because our first stop on this shocking journey is going to reveal the deadly secret behind those flawless white faces you see in every royal portrait. We're about to discover how the pursuit of pale perfection led to a beauty trend so toxic that it literally poisoned the women who used it. And trust me, when you hear about Queen Elizabeth's daily makeup routine, you'll never look at those museum paintings the same way again. Picture yourself standing in front of Queen Elizabeth's eyes. Vanity mirror on any given morning in 1588. What you're about to witness would make a modern makeup artist faint on the spot, because the foundation of royal beauty literally was built on a substance so toxic that it slowly murdered the women who wore it. Let me tell you about the deadliest beauty trend in royal history. This wasn't just any makeup. This was the ultimate status symbol, the Chanel No. 5 of the Renaissance era. And its main ingredient, pure white lead mixed with vinegar. Yes, you heard that right. The same lead that we now know caused brain damage, organ failure, and death, was being slathered on royal faces every single day. But here's where it gets really wild. The whiter your face, the more noble you were considered. Think about it. If you had a tan, it meant you worked outdoors like a peasant. But your skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent. It screamed that you were wealthy enough to stay indoors all day, protected from the sun. So these royal women were literally poisoning themselves to prove they didn't have to work for a living. Queen Elizabeth herself was obsessed with this look. Historical accounts describe her face as being painted so white that it looked like a mask. Venetian ambassadors wrote back to their courts, describing her appearance as frightening and unnatural. But Elizabeth didn't care. She applied this toxic mixture every single morning for over 4 decades. Now, let me walk you through what a typical morning looked like for Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting would arrive at dawn with their deadly concoctions. First, they'd apply a base layer of Susie, which was basically lead paint forfaces. The mixture was so thick that it had to be applied with brushes, not. Royal women using ceruse regularly suffered from what we now recognize as classic lead poisoning symptoms. We're talking about severe stomach pains that would double them over during important state ceremonies. Sudden fits of ragathought would come, out of nowhere, causing these normally composed queens to scream at their servants over minor issues. But perhaps the most tragic part was the cognitive decline. Lead poisoning affects the brain, causing confusion, memory loss, and difficulty making decisions. Imagine being a queen responsible for an entire kingdom while slowly losing your mental faculties to your daily beauty routine. There are documented cases of royal women forgetting the names of their own children, losing track of important political negotiations, all because they were literally painting poison on their faces every morning. Elizabeth's own physician, a man named William Gilbert, wrote in his private journals about his concerns regarding the Queen's daily beauty ritual. He noted that by her later years, Elizabeth's hands would shake uncontrollably, a classic sign of lead poisoning. But Heckle never directly tell the Queen to stop, because questioning royal beauty practices was essentially questioning the monarchy itself. Here's what makes this even more devastating. The beauty industry of the time knew exactly what they were selling. Lead-based cosmetics weren't some accidental poisoning. Makeup manufacturers were fully aware that their products were toxic, but The demand from royal courts was so high, and the profits so enormous that they kept producing these deadly concoctions. Anyway, the recipe for Susie was actually a closely guarded secret passed down through generations of sea cosmetic makers. It typically consisted of white lead carbonate mixed with vinegar, sometimes with added ingredients like egg whites or ground pearls for extra luxury. The more expensive versions contained actual silver particles, making them even more toxic, but also more prestigious. And this wasn't just an English problem. Across European courts, from France to Spain to Austria, royal women were all following the same deadly beauty trend. Catherine de Medici in France was known to apply ceruse so thickly that courtiers joked her face looked like a painted statue. Diane d'Are, the famous mistress of King Henry II, was so devoted to her white lead makeup that when her body was exhumed in 2009, scientists found dangerous levels of fleet in her hair samples over 450 years after her death. But here's the part that really gets me. These women weren't stupid. They were highly educated, politically savvy, and surrounded by the best physicians of their time. Yet, the social pressure to maintain that perfect pale complexion was so intense that they chose beauty over health, status over survival. The tragic irony is that the very thing meant to preserve their youth and beauty was aging them rapidly, destroying their health. By the time Elizabeth died at age 69, her face was described as being covered in deep wrinkles and scars. The exact opposite of the timeless beauty she'd been chasing her entire life. Now, you might be wondering how long this deadly trend lasted. Surely, people caught on eventually, right? Well, that's where our story takes an even more shocking turn, because while Elizabeth was slowly poisoning herself with lead-based makeup, her hair was hiding secrets that were equally disturbing and far more disgusting than you could possibly imagine. What I'm about to tell yawa out royal hair care will make you want to immediately wash your own hair 3 times, because when it comes to the most famous hairstyles in history, those towering elaborate creations we see in paintings, the shocking truth is that they were rarely if ever washed, and the consequences were absolutely revolting. Let's start with the most iconic hair in royal history, Marie Antoinette's legendary poof. You know those impossibly high sculptural hairstyles that seem to defy gravity? Well, here's what your history books didn't tell you. Marie Antoinette washed her hair exactly 4 times per year. 4 times in an entire year. Let that sink in for a moment. But it gets so much worse. Those magnificent hairstyles that took hours to create weren't just dirty. They were ecosystems. I'm talking about living, breathing communities of insects, rodents, and bacteria that called royal hair home. Court records from Versailles describe servants finding everything from lice and fleas to actual mice living in noble women's hairstyles. Now, you might be wondering how this was even possible. How do you go months without washing your hair and still look presentable? Well, the secret weapon of 18th century royal hair care was a combination that would horrify any modern stylist. Animal fat, flour, and powder. Lots and lots of powder. The process was absolutely disgusting. First, servants would coat hair with pig fat or beef tallow. Yes, actual animal grease to make its shape. Then they dust it with wheat flour to absorb some of the oil and give it texture. Finally, they'd cover the entire creation with white or gray powder made from ground rice or wheat starch. The result? Hair so stiff and solid that it could maintain its shape for weeks at a time. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, a man named Leonor Otier, actually wrote detailed instructions for maintaining these creations. His notes, which survive to this day, recommend refreshing the hairstyle by adding more powder every few days and using long hairpins to reorganize any displaced sections. Notice how he never once mentions washing. But here's where things get truly nightmarish. Because these hairstyles were so elaborate and time-consuming to create, Royal women would sleep sitting up for weeks to avoid disturbing them. They had special chairs designed for sleeping upright, and they'd wrap their heads in silk scarves to protect the style. Can you imagine sleeping sitting up for 3 weeks straight just to keep your hairdo intact? The French court actually had a term for this practice. Preservage literally means preservation of the hairstyle, and preserving these styles meant accepting some truly horrifying consequences. Court physicians' records describe royal women suffering from severe neck pain, headaches, and something they called hair fever, which we now know was probably infection from the bacteria breeding in their unwashed scalps. Let me tell you about one particularly distinct incident that happened to the Duchess of Devonshire in 1778. She had maintained one of these elaborate poof hairstyles for nearly 6 weeks when she began experiencing what she described as movement in her hair during a formal dinner. When her ladies-in-waiting finally dismantled the style later that evening, they discovered an entire family of mice had built a nest in the structure complete with baby mice. The Duchess wrote about this experience in a letter to her sister saying, "I fear I have been hosting uninvited guests for some time. The shame is unbearable. Yet, I confess I am not alone in this predicament." That last line is key. She wasn't alone. This was happening to royal women across Europe. But wait, there's more. The animal fat used to toast these elaborate creations would go rancid after just a few days. Imagine the smell. Weeks-old pig fat mixed with flour paste, unwashed human hair, and whatever insects had decided to move in. Court records describe visitors to Versailles commenting on the distinctive aroma that followed certain noble ladies wherever they went. The powder situation was equally revolting. By the 1770s, Marie Antoinette was using up to 3 pounds of powder per styling session. That's 3 lbof starch, sitting on top of weeks-old grease and unwashed hair. When it rained, the powder would turn into a substance that would drip down their faces and necks, often staining their elaborate gowns. And here's something that'll really gross you out. The longer these styles lasted, the more prestigious they became. Having hair that could maintain its shape for months was seen as the ultimate display of wealth and sophistication. It showed you had enough servants to maintain the style, enough money to afford the expensive powders and pomades, and enough leisure time to sit for hours while it was being constructed. The competition between royal women over who could maintain their hairstyle the longest became absolutely fierce. The Countess of Pollock, one of Marie Antoinette's closest friends, allegedly kept the same hairstyle for 11 weeks in 1782. By the end of that period, court gossip reported that she had to hold a perfumed handkerchief over her head whenever she entered a room to mask the smell of her own hair. But perhaps the most shocking part of this whole story is that these women knew exactly how disgusting their hair situation was. Private letters between noble ladies are filled with complaints about itching, smells, and unwanted residents in their hair. Yet they continued the practice because the social pressure was so intense that having clean hair was actually seen as a sign of poor breeding. Maris de Pompadour, Louis XV's famous mistress, wrote in her diary about the necessary sacrifices of beauty, specifically referring to the discomfort and hygiene issues associated with maintaining court hairstyles. She described the experience as enduring tempori, unpleasantness for lasting admiration. Now, you might think this madness was limited to France, but you'd wrong. Across the English Channel, Georgian ladies were following similar practices. Lady Mary Wortley Montego wrote extensively about the London method of hair care, which involved washing hair only quarterly and maintaining styles with pomatum, a scented grease made from pig fat and rosewater. The irony is absolute to Lindling. These women were spending fortunes on the finest silks, the most precious jewels, and the most luxurious cosmetics. Yet, they were walking around with hair that would make a homeless person feel superior about their hygiene. They were literally wearing their wealth while their scalps rotted underneath. But if you think unwashed hair was the worst of royal hygienisters, you're in for a truly shocking revelation. Because when we look inside, These royal mouths would discover dental practices so horrifying that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost pleasant by comparison. Imagine opening your mouth to speak and watching everyone in the room immediately take a step backward. That was the reality for many royal women, whose dental hygiene was so catastrophically bad that their breath could literally clear a room. But the visual horror of their teeth, that was somehow even worse than the smell. Queen Elizabeth I had what Spanish ambassador Count de Feria described as teeth like black tombstones rising from a swamp. And he wasn't being poetic. He was being frighteningly literal. By her 40s, Elizabeth's teeth had turned completely black from decay. And by her 60s, she had lost so many teeth that foreign dignitaries struggled to understand her speech during important negotiations. But here's the twisted irony that'll blow your mind. Elizabeth's rotten teeth were actually a status symbol, because in Tutter, England, sugar was so expensive that only the wealthy could afford to destroy their teeth with it. Having black, rotting teeth literally proved you were rich enough to eat yourself into dental disaster. Poor people who couldn't afford sugar actually had much better teeth than royalty. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical royal mouth looked like in the 16th and 17th centuries. Were we talking about teeth so decayed that they were often just broken stumps poking through inflamed, bleeding gums? The pain must have been absolutely excruciating. Yet these women continued consuming massive amounts of sugar, because of stopping would have been social suicide. Elizabeth consumed what historians estimate to be about 2 pounds of sugar per week, an astronomical amount by any standard. Her favorite treats included candied violets, sugared almonds, and something called banqueting stuff, which was basically pure sugar formed into decorative shapes. Contemporary accounts describe her constantly sucking on sugar lozenges during court proceedings, even while conducting affairs of state. The dental care available to royalty was, if anything, worse than having no dental care at all. Royal dentists, and I use that term very loosely, had exactly 3 tools at their disposal: pulling, burning, and praying. When a tooth became too painful to bear, their solution was to yank it out with primitive pliers, often taking chunks off jawbone with it. But the treatments they offered were absolutely horrifying. An unpopular remedy involved burning the gums with hot irons to cauterize the rot. Another favorite was to drill holes in healthy teeth and stuff them with lead. Yes, the same lead they were putting on their faces, believing this would prevent decay from spreading. Catherine de' Medici took dental horror to an entirely new level. Historical records show that she underwent what was essentially medieval root canals performed without any anesthesia. Over, court physicians would drill into her infected teeth using hand-cranked metal bits, then pack the holes with a mixture of crushed pearls and mercury. The agony must have been indescribable. Yet she endured these procedures multiple times because the alternative, being seen with missing teeth, was unthinkable. The French court actually developed an elaborate system of dental camouflage. Royal women would stuff their mouths with small cloths soaked in perfume to mask the smell of decay, and they learned to speak and smile in waisthead would minimize the visibility of their rotting teeth. There are detailed etiquette manuals from Versailles that include instructions on proper mouth positioning for ladies of declining dental fortune. But perhaps the most disturbing trend was the practice of dental transplantation. Wealthy royal women actually purchase healthy teeth from poor people, often young servants or peasants, and have them surgically implanted into their own mouths. The procedures were performed without sterilization or proper medical knowledge, leading to horrific infections that often killed both the donor and the recipient. Queen Anne of England was particularly notorious for these dental transplants. She reportedly went through dozens of donor teeth during her lifetime, as the transplanted teeth would inevitably become infected and fall out within weeks. Her personal physician, Dr. John Woodall, kept detailed records of these procedures, describing them as necessary vanities that oft prove fatal. The pain these royal women endured was beyond comprehension. Elizabeth's personal secretary, William Seal, wrote in his private diary about the Queen's tooth days. Periods when her dental pain was so severe that she couldn't eat solid food or speak clearly. During these episodes, which could last for weeks, all court business would essentially grind to a halt because the Queen was incapacitated by agony. And here's something that really puts their priorities in perspective. These women would rather suffer unimaginable pain than give up their social status. Elizabeth reportedly told her closest advisor that she would endure any torment rather than appear common. The pressure to maintain royal appearances was so intense that they chose over social embarrassment. The smell situation was equally horrific. Contemporary accounts described the breath of royal women as being so foul that courtiers would hold perfume hand corfies over their noses during conversations. The Spanish ambassador to Elizabeth wrote that approaching the Queen for an audience was like entering a queen house where the dead have been left to rot. But the visual aspect was somehow even worse than the smell. Portrait artists of the era actually developed techniques to paint royal women with their mouths closed, because showing their teeth would have been considered insulting to the monarchy. There's not a single formal portrait of Elizabeth from her later years that shows her teeth. Despite the fact that earlier portraits often featured her smile, the social implications were staggering. Royal marriages were often negotiated sight unseen, and many foreign princes got the shock of their lives when they met their intended brides. Henry IV of France reportedly fainted when he first saw his bride-to-be married smile during their wedding ceremony. The poor man simply wasn't prepared for the dental horror that awaited him. What makes this even more tragic is that these royal women were often highly intelligent, well-educated individuals who were capable of running entire kingdoms. Yet, they were essentially disabled by their own dental disasters. Elizabeth, despite being one of the most powerful monarchs in history, spent the last decades of her life in constant pain, struggling to eat, speak, and maintain her royal duties. The irony is that while these royal women were destroying their teeth with exquisite, the common people they ruled over had much better dental health simply because they couldn't afford the luxury of tooth decay. It was literally a case where wealth bought, suffering and poverty preserved health. But even as royal mouths were rotting from the inside out, there was an even more fundamental hygiene disaster happening that affected their entire bodies. Because while we've been focused on faces, hair, and teeth, we haven't yet talked about the one thing that might be the most shocking of all: their relationship with water itself. Here's a statement that will absolutely blow your mind. Queen Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, the woman who funded Christopher Columbus' voyage to the New World, proudly boasted that she had only bathed twice in her entire life, twice in 73 years of existence, and she considered this a virtue. But Isabella was, since some medieval anomaly, she was actually following the medical advice of her time, because in royal courts across Europe, water was considered one of the most dangerous substances on earth. Royal physicians genuinely believed that bathing could kill you, and they had elaborate medical theories to prove it. Let me take you into the mind of a 15th century royal doctor. They believed that human skin had tiny pores that when exposed to water would open up and allow deadly diseases to enter the body. They called this corrupt air penetration, and they were absolutely convinced that a single bath could lead to plague consumption or instant death. So these royal women weren't just being lazy. They were literally following doctors' orders when they avoided water. The medical establishment of the time taught that the human body had a natural protective layer of oils and dirt they acted like armor against disease. Washing this away was considered medical suicide. Court physicians would prescribe dry cleaning instead, rubbing the body with linen cloths to remove surface dirt while preserving the essential protective barrier. Isabella's famous bathing record, once at birth and before her wedding, was actually held up as a model of perfect health maintenance. She lived to be 73 in an era when most people died before 40. So, In the minds of medieval doctors, bathing avoidance was proof that their theories were correct. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Royal courts developed an entire alternative hygiene system based on avoiding water at all costs. Instead of bathing, royal women would undergo elaborate dry cleaning rituals that were somehow supposed to be more hygienic than actually washing with water. These dry cleaning sessions were absolutely ridiculous. Servants would rub the royal body with expensive imported linen soaked in rosewater, wine, or even urine. Yes, urine. Because these liquids were considered safer than plain water, the process could take hours as servants meticulously wiped down every inch of royal skin while the queen lay motionless on special tables, destined for this purpose. Queen Anne of Brittany took this to an extreme level. Her daily hygiene routine, documented in detail by her ladies-in-waiting, involved being rubbed down with silk cloth soaked in wine from her personal vineyard. She believed that the wine would kill germs, while the silk would polish her skin to perfection. The result, she smelled like a winery and felt constantly sticky, but she was convinced she was the cleanest person in France. The French court under Louis XIV developed what they called la toilette sèche, the dry toilet. This was an elaborate ceremony where the king or queen would bleed without a drop of water touching their skin. Servants would use silk brushes to remove dead skin, followed by perfumed powders to absorb oils and finely scented ointments, tosil, in the natural protective barriers. But the most shocking part of this water phobia was how it affected royal women during childbirth. Medieval medical texts specifically warned against allowing new mothers to bathe for at least 40 days after giving birth, believing that water exposure during this vulnerable period would cause immediate death. So these women would go through the trauma of medieval childbirth and then lie in their own filth for over a month because their doctors told them that cleaning themselves would be fatal. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, endured 6 pregnancies following these water avoidance protocols. Her personal physician, Dr. Fernando Victoria, kept detailed notes about her post-birth care, which included strict instructions to preserve the childbed humors through avoidance of aquatic contamination. Translation: don't let her wash herself under any circumstances. The irony is absolutely staggering. These royal women were surrounded by the finest luxuries money could buy: silk sheets, golden chambers, armies of servants. Yet they were living in conditions that would horrify a modern homeless shelter. And they thought they were being sophisticated and medical about it. The smell must have been absolutely overkill. Contemporary accounts describe royal courts as having a distinctive aroma that could be detected from several rooms away. Ambassadors from cleaner cultures would often comment on the pungent atmosphere of European palaces. The Moroccan ambassador to the French court in 1699 wrote that the Christians emit such odors that one wonders how they can bear each other's company. But here's what really gets me. These royal women actually developed a hierarchy based on how bad they smelled. The stronger your natural aroma, the more it proved you were following proper medical protocols. Having a strong body odor was literally a status symbol, because it showed you were wealthy enough to afford the best medical advice, and disciplined enough to follow it. Royal perfume wasn't used to smell good. It was used to smell different. The goal wasn't to mask body odor, but to create complex combinations that would distinguish royal smells from common smells. Marie de Medici reportedly spent more on perfumes than some nobles spent on their entire estates. Not to smell clean, but to smell uniquely royal. The water phobia extended to drinking as well. Royal women were often discouraged from drinking plain water, which was considered dangerous for internal consumption. Instead, they drank wine, beer, or heavily spiced beverages that were supposed to be safer for royal constitutions. This led to a whole other set of health problems. But at least they weren't risking the deadly dangers of H2O. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire situation was that these intelligent, powerful women were essentially prisoners of medical misinformation. Queen Isabella conquered kingdoms, negotiated international treaties, and changed the course of world history. Yet, she was afraid to take a bath because her doctors told her it would kill her. The rare occasions when royalty did encounter water were treated like medical emergencies. When Princess Isabella of Portugal accidentally fell into a fountain during a court celebration in 1523, her entire medical team rushed to treat what they considered a potentially fatal exposure. She was immediately wrapped in heated blankets, fed warming spices, and kept under medical observation for weeks to watch for signs of water poisoning. Yet, despite all this water avoidance, there was one aspect of royal hygiene that was even more shocking than their bathing habits, because when these women needed to address their beauty concerns, they turned to substances that made dirty bathwater look like a health tonic. They were about to embark on beauty treatments so toxic and dangerous that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost reasonable. When royal women couldn't achieve beauty through cleanliness, they turned to chemistry, and the results were absolutely lethal. We're about to dive into beauty treatments so toxic that they make modern horror movies look like children's cartoons, because the sea queens weren't just applying makeup. They were essentially conducting chemical warfare on their own bodies. Let me introduce you to Diane Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France, who was considered the most beautiful woman of her era. Her secret: she drank liquid gold every single morning for over 30 years. Not metaphorical gold, actual literal gold, dissolved in various potions that she believed would preserve her youth forever. When scientists exhumed her body in 2008, they found gold levels in her hair that were 500 times higher than normal human levels. But Diane's gold consumption was just the beginning of royal beauty madness. These women were ingesting and applying substance that would be classified as chemical weapons by today's standards. Mercury, arsenic, antimony, lead if it was toxic. They put it on their faces or drank it for beauty. Mercury was particularly popular for treating what they delicately called complexion issues. Royal women suffering from syphilis, which was rampant in European courts due to their, shall we say, flexible moral standards, would undergo mercury treatments that were supposed to clear their skin. The process involved sitting in sealed chambers, while mercury was heated below them, allowing the toxic vapors to penetrate their skin. The side effects were absolutely horrifying. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, so these women would develop uncontrollable shaking. It causes tooth loss, adding to their already catastrophic dental problems. It affects the brain, leading to what court physicians called mercury madness, sudden fits of rage, paranoia, and bizarre behavior that would last for days. Catherine de' Medici was notorious for her mercury treatments. Court records describe her weekly purification sessions, where she would be sealed in a cabinet lined with mirrors, while mercury was vaporized below. She believed the mercury vapors would not only cure her skin problems, but also preserve her beauty indefinitely. The reality: by her 50s, she was suffering from severe neurological damage that made her appear drunk during important state functions. But if you think mercury was bad, wait until you hear about arsenic beauty treatments. Renaissance royal woman discovered that small doses of arsenic could create a translucent porcelainic complexion that was highly praised in court circles. So they began taking what they called arsenic complexion pills, literally poisoning themselves or body. The Borgias, that infamous Italian royal family, were particularly obsessed with arsenic beauty treatments. Lucretia Borgia, reportedly, took arsenicals daily from the age of 14 until her death at 39. Her contemporaries described her as having an almost supernatural beauty, skin so pale it seemed to glow from within. What they were actually seeing was the early stages of chronic arsenic poisoning, which causes a distinctive pallor that was mistaken for ethereal beauty. Here's where it gets really twisted. These arsenic treatments actually worked in short term, Small doses of arsenic do create a pale, almost translucent skin tone that was considered the height of beauty in Renaissance Europe. So these women saw immediate results and assumed they discovered the secret to eternal youth. What they didn't realize was that they were slowly murdering themselves. The French court developed an entire arsenic beauty industry. Madame de Montespan, Louis XIII's most famous mistress, employed a team of alchemists who created personalized arsenic formulations based on her skin type and body goals. These beauty chemists would adjust the arsenic concentration depending on whether she wanted to achieve morning glow, evening radiance, or ball perfection. But the most shocking arsenic story belongs to Lady Frances Howard, who became obsessed with achieving the perfect pale complexion for her wedding to the Earl of Somerset. She began taking increasingly large doses of arsenic pills, convinced that more poison would equal more beauty. By her wedding day, she had achieved the ghostly pale look she desired, but she was also suffering from severe intermittent damage. She died less than 2 years later, and her autopsy revealed arsenic levels that would have killed a horse. The antimony craze was equally deadly. This metallic element was used to create koa-like eye makeup that was supposed to make the eyes appear larger and more luminous. Royal women would apply antimony directly to their eyelids and even inside their eyes, believing it would enhance their natural beauty. The Duchess of Marlborough was famous for her antimony eye treatments. She would have her servants apply liquid antimony to her eyes every morning, often causing severe irritation and temporary blindness. But she continued the practice for decades because she believed it gave her eyes a supernatural sparkle that no other woman could achieve. What makes all of this even more disturbing is that these women knew their beauty treatments were dangerous. Court physicians regularly documented the side effects: hair loss, skin discoloration, neurological troubles, organ damage. Yet, the treatments continued because the social pressure to maintain beauty was more powerful than the fear of death. Queen Anna of Poland actually kept a detailed diary of her beauty treatment side effects, documenting everything from mercury-induced tremors to arsenic-related stomach pains. Yet she continued her toxic beauty routine for over 20 years, because, as she wrote, "To apricot is a fate worse than death, and death may be avoided, but kamanas cannot." The beauty chemical industry that grew up around royal courts was essentially a network of legalized poisoners. These beauty alchemists would create custom toxic formulations for their royal clients, experimenting with different combinations of deadly substances to achieve specific aesthetic effects. They were literally conducting human experiments on some of the most powerful women in Europe. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this toxic beauty obsession was how it affected royal decision-making. These women were running entire kingdoms while slowly poisoning themselves with beauty treatments. Their judgment was impaired by chronic toxic exposure. Their health was deteriorating and their pain levels were off the charts. Yet, they were expected to make decisions that affected millions of people. The irony is heartbreaking. These royal women had access to the finest education, the best advisors, and unlimited resources. Yet, they chose to slowly kill themselves with beauty treatments because the alternative, appearing less than perfect, was socially unacceptable. And speaking of socially unacceptable, there's one aspect of royal life that was even more shocking than their toxic beauty routines. Because while these women were poisoning themselves from the outside, there was something happening with their most basic clothing that would make a modern person question everything they thought they knew about royal sophistication. Beneath those magnificent gowns that cost more than our entire villages lay a secret so disgusting that it would make you grateful for modern laundry services. CUZ royal women, despite wearing the most expensive fabrics in the world, other relationship with their undergarments that was absolutely revolting. Here's a fact that will change how you view every period drama forever. Most royal women owned only 1 or 2 sets of undergarments for their entire lives, and they would wear the same chemise. That's the basic undergarment that went directly against their skin for months at a time without changing it. We're talking about 3, 4, sometimes 6 months of continuous wear. Queen Elizabeth owned exactly 3 shmis throughout her entire 45-year reign. 3. The royal laundry records from Greenwich Palace, which still exist today, show that these undergarments were washed approximately 4 times per year. That means Elizabeth wore the same sweat-soaked, body oil-saturated piece of linen against her skin for 3 months straight before it saw soap and water. But here's what makes this even more shocking. This wasn't poverty or laziness. This was actually considered proper royal behavior. Changing your undergarments frequently was seen as a sign of vanity and moral weakness. The longer you could wear the same shmis, the more it proved your spiritual discipline and noble character. The medieval church had actually convinced women that suffering in dirty undergarments was a form of religious devotion. They called it mortification the flesh, and it was supposed to make them more holy and worthy of God's favor. So these queens were literally competing to see who could endure the most disgusting undergarment situation as proof of their spiritual superiority. Seen Margaret of Hungary, who was a royal princess before becoming a saint, was famous for wearing the same wool undergarment for 7 consecutive years without washing it once. When Stefanelli died, her ladies-in-waiting reported that the garment had essentially fused with her skin and had to be carefully peeled away from her body. The church held this up as evidence of her extraordinary holiness. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these royal undergarments actually looked like after months of continuous wear. Contemporary descriptions from royal wardrobe inventories are absolutely horrifying. We're talking about fabric so stiff with accumulated body oils, sweat, and other bodily fluids that it could literally stand up on its own. Catherine of Aragon's wardrobe inventory, compiled after her death, describes her personal chemist as being of such firmness and discoloration as to require sharp implements for removal. The royal heiresses had developed special tools, essentially medieval crowbars, to pry these garments off royal bodies because the fabric had become so rigid and stuck to the skin. The smell situation was beyond description. Royal women would layer expensive perfumes and sachets of herbs throughout their gowns to mask the overwhelming stench emanating from their undergarments. But according to contemporary accounts, the smell would still seep through all those layers of silk and velvet, creating what one Spanish ambassador described as an aroma that follows Her Majesty like a faithful hound. But wait, it gets so much worse, because these unwashed undergarments weren't just dirty and smelly. They were breeding grounds for every parasite, bacteria, and infection you could imagine. Royal women lived in a constant state of what we would now recognize as severe skin infections, rashes, and infestations. Lice were so common in royal undergarments that court ladies actually had special ivory combs designated specifically for lice removal. These knit combs were often decorated with precious stones and were considered dental accessories for any well-dressed noblewoman. Having beautiful lice removal tools was literally a status symbol. Merida Medici's personal inventory lists no fewer than 12 jeweled and knit combs, each designed for different types of lice removal. She had diamond-encrusted combs for head lice, emerald study domes for body lice, and specially designed ruby combs for what the inventory delicately refers to as intimate parasites. The fact that she needed 12 different specialized tools tells you everything about the scope of her infestation problem. The flea situation was equally horrifying. Royal women would actually wear what they called flea furs, small pieces of fur sewn into their undergarments that were supposed to attract fleas away from their skin. The theory was that fleas preferred animal fur to human skin. So, these fur patches would act like flea magnets, concentrating the insects in specific areas where they could be more easily removed. But here's the part that really gets me. These weren't desperate survival measures. These were luxury items. Wealthy royal women would pay enormous sums for exotic furs, specifically to attract fleas in their undergarments. Man flea furs were particularly prized because they were both effective at attracting fleas and beautiful enough to show off to other noble ladies during private dressing ceremonies. The skin problems caused by these disgusting undergarment practice were legendary. Royal women suffered from what court physicians called schmee's rot, severe skin infections caused by prolonged contact with dirty fabric. These infections would create open sores, rashes, and something truly horrifying called weeping skin, where infected areas would constantly ooze fluids. Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, was documented as suffering from such severe keys rot that she couldn't wear certain colors because the oozing from her skin infections would stain the fabric. Her personal physician, Dr. Butts, prescribed a treatment that involved rubbing raw garlic directly onto the infected areas while she was still wearing the semi-dirty undergarment that had caused the infections in the first place. The social implications were staggering. Royal women would actually bond over their shared undergarment suffering. There are documented cases of noble ladies comparing their lice infestations, like we might compare jewelry today. Having particularly impressive parasites was seen as proof that you were following proper royal protocols. The Duchess of Burgundy wrote extensively in her private letters about what she called my faithful companions, referring to the lice colony that had taken up permanent residence in her schmees. She described them with genuine affection, as if they were beloved pets rather than disease-carrying parasites. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire situation was how it affected royal health and longevity. These constant skin infections weakened their immune systems, made them more susceptible to serious diseases, and caused chronic pain that affected every aspect of their lives. Yet, they continued the practice because changing your undergarments frequently was considered morally questionable. The laundry situation was its own nightmare. When royal undergarments were finally washed, remember this happened maybe 4 times per year. The process was so disgusting that special servants had to be hired specifically for this task. These schmees washers were paid danger wages because the job was considered so revolting and potentially disciplining. The washing process itself was absolutely medieval. The garments would be soaked in lye so strong that it would burn the washer's hands, then beaten with wooden paddles to break up the accumulated filth. Even after this aggressive treatment, many garments never came completely clean, stains and odor that would last for the remainder of their use. What's truly tragic is that these royal women were making decisions that affected entire kingdoms, while dealing with constant physical discomfort from their disgusting undergarments. Imagine trying to negotiate international treaties while your skin is covered in infected sores from months-old dirty linen. Yet, this was considered normal, even admirable behavior for royal women. But if you think their undergarment situation was the worst aspect of royal hygiene, you're about to discover medical practices that were so barbaric and counterproductive that they make dirty underwear seem like a minor inconvenience. Nothing could have prepared you for what royal women endured in the name of medical treatment and beauty enhancement. When these queens felt unwell or wanted to improve their appearance, they subjected themselves to procedures so barbaric that they make medieval torture devices look humane. We're talking about medical practices that were essentially legalized, self-harm disguised as healthcare. Bloodletting was the crown jewel of royal medical treatment, and it wastes absolutely everywhere. Royal women would have their blood drained regularly, not because they were sick, but because their doctors believed that removing blood would make them more beautiful, healthier, and even more intelligent. Queen Catherine de' Medici had her 3 times per week for over 30 years, losing what modern calculations date to be over 2,000 pints of blood during her lifetime. But here's the truly insane part. They weren't just making small cuts and collecting a little blood. These royal bloodletting sessions were like medieval horror movies. Court physicians would use devices called flea essentially medieval box cutters, to make deep incisions in royal arms, necks, and even foreheads. Then they'd attach brass cups to literally suck the blood out of these wounds. The process was agonizing and dangerous. Merid Medici's personal physician, Dr. Jean Ryland, kept detailed records of her bloodletting sessions. He described making incisions so deep that they required stitching afterward and bleeding her until she lost consciousness, which he considered a sign that the treatment was working properly. She would often lose so much blood that she couldn't stand for days afterward. But if you think bloodletting was bad, wait until you hear about leech therapy. Royal women would have hundreds of live leeches applied to their faces and bodies, believing that these blood-sucking parasites would cure everything from headaches to bad complexions. The French court was particularly obsessed with facial leech treatments, but dozens of leeches would be attached to a royal woman's face while she sat motionless for hours. Catherine the Great of Russia was famous for her weekly facial leech sessions. She would have up to 50 leeches attached to her face at once, covering her forehead, cheeks, and neck. Court witnesses described her during these treatments as looking like a living nightmare with black leeches writhing across her face while blood trickled down her neck. She endured this horror for decades because she believed it gave her skin a youthful glow. The medical theory behind all this bloodletting was something called balancing the humors. Royal physicians believed that human bodies contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and valeness and ugliness resulted from having too much of any one humor, since blood was considered the most dangerous humor to have in excess. Regular bleeding was prescribed for virtually every ailment, but the humor balancing treatments got even more disgusting. To reduce excess phlegm, royal women would undergo procedures designed to make them vomit for hours. They'd be given potions containing antimony, mercury, and other toxins that would cause violent, prolonged vomiting sessions that court physicians believed would purge their systems of disease-causing phlegm. Anne of Austria, Louis XIV's mother, famously underwent a vomiting treatment that lasted for 3 consecutive days. Her personal physician fed her increasingly powerful emetics, substances designed to cause vomiting until she was bringing up blood. He recorded this as a successful treatment because, in his words, Her Majesty has expelled the corrupted humors that were causing her melancholy. The bile balancing treatments were equally horrific. To purge excess yellow bile, royal women would take power laxatives that would cause uncontrollable diarrhea for days. These weren't gentle herbal remedies. These were brutal sedatives containing mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that would essentially poison the digestive system into violent evacuation. But perhaps the most disturbing treatments were those designed to balance black bile, which physicians believed caused depression and ugliness. These treatments involved deliberately inducing seizures in royal women through the use of electrical devices, toxic fumes, and physical shock. The theory was that violent convulsions would shake the black bile loose and restore mental and physical beauty. The Duchess of Orleans underwent regular seizure treatments administered by the royal physician Dr. Antoine Vallot. He would place her in a sealed chamber filled with burning sulfur fumes until she began convulsing, then apply to her temples to intensify the seizures. She endured this treatment monthly for over 15 years because Dr. Dot convinced her that it was preventing her from becoming ugly and insane. The pain levels these royal women endured during medical treatments were absolutely unimaginable. Remember, this was centuries before, so every procedure was performed on fully conscious patients. Court records describe royal women screaming so loudly during treatments that their cries could be heard throughout entire palaces. But here's what really gets me. These women would often schedule their medical torture sessions around social events. Marie Antoinette would plan her bloodletting sessions for the day before important balls, believing that the blood loss would give her skin a fashionable pale complexion. She would literally drain herself nearly to unconsciousness as a beauty treatment. The infection rates from these procedures were staggering. Without sterilization or proper medical knowledge, royal women were constantly developing serious infections from their medical treatments. Open wounds from bloodletting would become septic, leech bite marks would develop into abscesses, and the toxic substances used in purging treatments would cause organ damage. Queen Maria Theresa of Spain died from complications related to her medical treatments rather than from any actual disease. Her autopsy revealed that she had suffered massive internal damage from decades of mercury purging, lead-based medications, and repeated bloodletting. Her personal physician noted that her organs showed more damage from medical treatments than from natural aging. The most tragic aspect of this medical nightmare was that these treatments often made royal women sicker than they were before. A royal woman might visit her physician complaining of a minor headache and end up bedridden for weeks from the bloodletting and purging treatments prescribed to cure it. Yet, they continued seeking these treatments because the alternative, appearing to neglect their health, was socially unacceptable. The competitive aspect of medical suffering was particularly disturbing. Royal women would actually brag about how much medical torture they could endure. Having the strength to survive the extreme bloodletting or prolonged purging treatments was seen as proof of noble character and royal breeding. The Princess Palatine wrote extensively about what she called her medical victories, instances where she had served particularly brutal treatments that had incapacitated other court ladies. She described enduring a bloodletting session where she lost so much blood that she couldn't speak for 2 days as one of her proudest achievements. But even as these royal women were subjecting themselves to medieval medical torture in the name of health and beauty, there was an aspect of their daily lives that was even more shocking. Because when nature called, the solutions they came up with were so disgusting and impractical that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost civilized. Brace yourself for the most stomach-turning chapter of our royal hygiene nightmare, because we're about to discuss what happened when nature called in the most magnificent palaces in history. Thirst management situation in royal courts was so revolting that it would make a modern gas station restroom look like the Ritz-Carlton. Let's start with the Palace of Versailles, the crown jewel of European royal residences. Hameto, the most powerful monarchs in the world. This magnificent palace, with its hall of mirrors and golden chamber, just over 10,000 people at its peak. And here's the shocking truth. It had exactly 0 functioning toilets. None, not a single proper bathroom for 10,000 residents. Instead, Versailles operated on what I can only describe as a human waste-free row. Courtiers, including the highest-ranking noble ladies, would simply relieve themselves wherever they happened to be when nature called, behind tapestries, in stairwells, in corners of the most beautiful rooms in France. The palace reeked so badly that visitors often fainted upon entering. But it gets infinitely worse when we talk about the royal women themselves. Because while common courtiers might squat behind a curtain, queens and princesses had their own special waste management nightmare. They used chamber pots in full view of their ladies-in-waiting, and these pots were only emptied when they became completely full. Martonis's chamber pot routine was documented in excruciating detail by her lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan. The queen would use the same ornate golden pot for days at a time, and it would sit in her bedroom accumulating waste until it was lit. Only then would servants be allowed to empty it, and this happened maybe once or twice per week. But hair swear, it gets truly revolting. Royal protocol demanded that these chamber pots be emptied by specific higher-ranking courtiers as part of their official duties. At the English court, there was actually a position called Groom of Festool, and it was considered one of the most prestigious jobs in the palace, because it meant you had intimate access to the monarch. The groom of the stool wasn't just responsible for emptying chamber pots. They were required to inspect the royal waste for signs of illness, document its color and consistency, and report any changes to royal physicians. These reports still exist in palace archives, and they contain detailed descriptions of royal bowel movements that are absolutely mortifying to read. Henry VII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth of Furs, elevated this waist inspection to an art form. Her groom of the stool, a woman named Blanche Parry, kept daily records of Elizabeth's bathroom habits for over 30 years. These records revealed that Elizabeth often went weeks without a bowel movement due to her terrible diet and lack of physical activity, leading to waist inspection sessions that Parry described as trials of extraordinary endurance. The smell situation in royal palaces was beyond description. Contemporary accounts describe the stench as being so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs over their faces at all times. The Spanish ambassador to Versailles wrote that the aroma of human waste permeates every corridor, every chamber, every breath of air within these golden walls. But the most disturbing aspect of royal waste management was what happened during formal ceremonies. Royal women couldn't leave important state functions to use bathroom. Royal protocol forbade interrupting ceremonies for personal needs. So they developed what can only be described as the most disgusting solution imaginable. During lengthy court ceremonies, which could last for 6 to 8 hours, royal women would wear what they called relief garments, essential medieval diapers made of linen and wool that would absorb their waste during public events. They would sit through entire state dinners, treaty signings, and diplomatic receptions while soiling them's thieves, because leaving would have been a diplomatic insult. The cleanup process after these formal events was absolutely horrifying. Teams of servants would have to carefully remove these soiled garments from royal women and clean them while the ladies remained standing. This process, called the evening restoration of in, took hours and required multiple servants working in shifts because the smell was so overwhelming. Catherine Adetti was notorious for her formal event accidents. Italian diplomatic recs described her soiling herself during a 4-hour peace treaty negotiation with Spain, then continuing the diplomatic discussion while sitting in her own waste because leaving would have implied that Spain's proposals weren't worth her full attention. The royal dining situation made everything worse. These palace dining halls had no ventilation systems, so the smell of accumulated human waste would mix with food odor during meals. Diplomatic banquets at Versailles were famous for causing foreign dignitaries to vomit at the table, not from the food, but from the food overwhelming stench of human waste that permeated the dining experience. Palace waste disposal was handled by baits of servants called night soilmen, who would collect the accumulated waste from chamber pots, relief garments, and random palace corners during the overnight hours. These men had the highest mortality rate of any palace workers because exposure to human waste led to constant illness and disease. The disposal process itself was medieval. All palace waste was dumped into enormous pits dug outside the palace walls, creating what were essentially lakes of human sewage. During hot summer months, the smell from these waste pits would drift back into the palace, making the indoor air even more unbreathable. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this entire waste nightmare was how it affected international diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors would often cut their visits short because they literally couldn't tolerate the sanitary conditions in royal palaces. Trade negotiations failed because diplomatic delegations would become too ill from the waste exposure to continue talks. The Russian ambassador to Versailles in 1717 wrote that conducting diplomacy in these conditions requires the constitution of a soldier and the stomach of a peasant. I fear for the future of international relations if such environments become the standard for royal courts. Royal women themselves seemed almost immune to these horrific conditions, but only because they had lived with them their entire lives. They had developed what court physicians called palace nose, a condition where prolonged exposure to waste odor had essentially destroyed their ability to smell normally. Mary Antoinette's physician noted that the queen had lost most of her sense of smell by age 25 due to constant exposure to waste odor in palace environments. This condition was so common among royal women that having a functional sense of smell was actually seen as a sign that someone was new to court life. The tragic irony is that these royal women were living in palaces that cost more than entire national budgets, wearing gowns worth fortunes, eating off golden plates. Yet, they were essentially living in conditions worse than most farm animals. The disconnect between their magnificent public imagined their revolting private reality was absolutely staggering. But even as the sea queens were navigating their daily waste management nightmares, there was another assault on their senses happening, because while their palaces reeked of human waste, they were fighting back with perfume applications so extreme and overwhelming that they created an entirely different kind of olfactory horror. The battle against their own stench led royal women to commit acts of perfume violence that were truly breathtaking in their excess. We're not talking about a delicate spritz of Chanel. We're talking about perfume applications so extreme that they created their own health crisis and literally poisoned the air around these queens. Catherine de Medici didn't just wear perfume, she weaponized it. This woman used so much fragrance that contemporary accounts describe her arrival at social gatherings as being preceded by a wall of scent that would hit people before she even entered the room. She employed a team of 16 perfumers whose sole job was to keep her saturated in fragrance from dawn until midnight. But here's where Catherine's perfume obsession turned deadly. She began experimenting with perfumed gloves that were soaked in solutions containing not just fragrant oils, but actual poisons. These weren't just beauty accessories. They were potential murder weapons disguised as fashion statements. She would give these perfume gloves as gifts to police, knowing that the extended skin contact would slowly poison the recipients. The most shocking case involved Jeanne d'Elra, Queen of Navarre, who died after wearing a pair of Catherine's perfumed gloves for just 3 days. The gloves were soaked in a mixture of musk, ambergris, and arsenic, creating a deadly combination that smelled divine while slowly killing the wearer. When Jeanne's body was examined, investigators found chemical burns on her hands that matched the exact pattern of the glove's lace trim. But Catherine wasn't the only royal woman drowning herself in dangerous fragrances. Marie Antoinette's perfume consumption was so extreme that French treasury actually had a separate budget line item just for her fragrance expenses. She went through approximately 12 bottles of concentrated perfume per week. That's nearly 2 bottles per day. Marie Antoinette's morning perfume ritual was absolutely insane. Her lattice-in-waiting would begin by soaking her entire body with rose water, not just sprinkling, but literally pouring gallons of scented water over her skin. Then they would apply concentrated perfume oils to every inch of her body using sponges and brushes, building up layers of different scents, like some kind of olfactory lasagna. The process took over 2 hours every morning and used enough perfume to send a modern department store. Her perfume bills from 1785 show purchases of over 300 bottles of concentrated essence in a single month. To put that in perspective, she was using more perfume in a month than most people today use in their entire lifetime. But the really disturbing part was how this extreme perfume use affected everyone around her. Servants working in Marie Antoinette's chambers regularly fainted from what court physicians called fragrance poisoning, a condition caused by inhaling too much concentrated perfume in enclosed spaces. The Queen's personal chamber had to bear it out 4 hours each day, just to make it safe for human occupancy. The perfume competition between royal women became absolutely cutthroat. They weren't just trying to smell good, they were trying to create scent signature so powerful and distinctive that they could dominate any social gathering through sheer olfactory force. It was like chemical warfare disguised as elegance. D'Andre Potier, Henry II's mistress, famously created what she called her scent armor, a perfume blend so strong that it could be detected from over 100 feet away. She would arrive at court functions like a perfumed hurricane, literally forcing other nobles to retreat to the far sides of rooms to escape her overwhelming fragrant cloud. The ingredients used in these royal perfumes were often more expensive than gold, and just as ambergris, which comes from whale intestines and cost more per ounce than precious gems, was mixed with musk from exotic animals, rare flowers that bloomed only in specific climates, and often toxic substances like mercury and lead that were believed to make fragrances last longer. But here's what really blows my mind. Many of these royal perfumes were specifically designed to mask the smell of death and disease, as these women's bodies began to deteriorate from their toxic beauty routines, poor diets, and unsanitary life conditions. Their natural body odor became increasingly horrific, so they would apply stronger and stronger perfumes to cover up the fact that they were literally rotting from the inside. Queen Mary of England, also known as Bloody Mary, developed what court observers described as a corpse-like odor during her final years, probably due to the uterine cancer that eventually killed her. Her response: she began using a perfume blend that contained so much musk and civet that ambassadors complained it made their eyes water and caused severe headaches during audiences. The French court developed an entire perfume hierarchy based on social rank. Lower nobles were only allowed to use certain scents, while higher-ranking royal women had exclusive access to the most potent and expensive fragrances. Breaking these perfume protocols was considered a serious social offense that could result in banishment from court. But the most bizarre aspect of this perfume obsession was how it affected royal decision-making. These women were conducting affairs of state while essentially high on perfume fumes. The chemical effects of inhaling massive amounts of concentrated fragrance daily caused everything from severe headaches to hallucinations to respiratory problems. Merida Medici's physician noted that the queen often experienced what he called perfume episodes where the chemical overload from her fragrance use would cause temporary insanity. She would become convinced that people were trying to poison her through their scents, and would demand that everyone in her presence undergo scent purification before approaching her. The economic impact of royal perfume consumption was the French perfume industry essentially existed to serve the insane fragrance demands of Versailles. Entire ships would arrive from exotic locations, carrying nothing but rare perfume ingredients for the royal court. The cost of keeping Marianne Antoinette properly perfumed was equivalent to maintaining a small army. Contemporary accounts describe diplomatic meetings where the combined perfume clouds of various royal women would create a fog so thick that people couldn't see across conference tables. Foreign ambassadors would literally need to hold perfume handkerchiefs over their faces just to breathe during negotiations. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this perfume mania was that it never actually solved the underlying problem, despite drowning themselves in the most expensive fragrances in the world. These royal women still smelled terrible underneath it all. They were essentially creating electric chaos, combining the worst body odor imaginable with overwhelming chemical fragrances to create scent combinations that were somehow worse than either smell alone. The health consequences were severe and long-lasting. Royal women who survived into old age often suffered from permanent respiratory damage caused by decades of perfume inhalation. Their sense of smell was completely destroyed. Their lungs were scarred and many developed chronic breathing problems that made their final years even more miserable. Yet, even as these queens were suffocating themselves and everyone around them with toxic fragrance clouds, there was another aspect of their monthly lives that was so shocking and barbaric that it makes perfume poisoning seem like a minor inconvenience. Because when it came to dealing with their natural biological cycles, royal women faced challenges that were both deeply personal and utterly horrifying. Every month, royal women faced what was considered the ultimate shame and danger of female existence. But the medieval solutions to this natural biological process were so horrifying and unsanitary that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost civilized by comparison. Medieval and Renaissance royal women had no access to anything resembling modern menstrual products. Instead, they used what were essentially rags, pieces of fold linen, wool, or whatever fabric they could find that they would stuff between their legs and hope for the best. These makeshift solutions were called clouts, and they were about as effective as you'd imagine. But here's what makes this truly shocking. These royal women would use the same clouts for their entire menstrual cycle, sometimes for 7 to 10 days, without washing or changing. They would simply add more layers of fabric as the existing ones became saturated, creating what can only be described as a medieval menstrual nightmare. Queen Catherine of Aragon's personal accounts, discovered in the Spanish archives, reveal the disturbing reality of royal period management. She describes using the same set of linen clouts for her entire cycle, washing them only at the very end when they had become completely unusable. The smell and discomfort she endured during her monthly cycles contributed to what court physicians called her a melancholic humors. The religious implications made everything worse. The medieval Catholic Church considered menstruating women to boinklian and cursed by God. Royal women during their periods were forbidden from entering churches, participating in religious ceremonies, or even touching holy objects. They were essentially quarantined in special chambers called red tents, where they would remain isolated until their cycles ended. Merida Medici spent 1 week out of every month locked away in what the French court called La Chambre Rouge, the Red Chamber. This wasn't just social isolation. It was complete banishment from royal duties. During these periods, she couldn't conduct state business, meet with advisors, or even see her own children. She was treated like a diseased person who might contaminate everything she touched. The isolation chambers themselves were absolutely medieval. These rooms had no windows, minimal furniture, and were considered so contaminated by menstrual presence that they had to be fumigated with burning herbs after each use. Royal women would spend 7 days in these dark, stuffy chambers with minimal food and water because even their servants were afraid to enter and risk contamination. But the most disturbing aspect was how royal periods affected international diplomacy. Important negotiations would be postponed, treaties delayed, and state visits rescheduled whenever royal women entered their monthly cycles. The Spanish ambassador to the English court wrote in 1583 that the Queen's monthly indisposition has delayed our trade negotiations for the 3rd consecutive month, as Her Majesty cannot be approached during these times of family corruption. The medical treatments prescribed for royal menstruation were absolutely horrific. Court physicians believed that menstrual blood was toxic and needed to be purged from the body as quickly as possible. They would prescribe powerful laxatives, emetics, and bloodletting treatments to cleanse royal women during their cycles, essentially torturing them while they were already suffering. Queen Elizabeth's physician, Dr. John, prescribed a monthly treatment that involved bleeding her from both arms while simultaneously giving her mercury-based purges to expel the corrupted humors. Elizabeth would endure this additional torture every month for decades, believing it was necessary to prevent the menstrual blood from poisoning her entire system. The hygiene situation during royal periods was beyond description. Without proper or containment, menstrual blood would stain clothing, furniture, and bed linens. Royals developed special techniques for dealing with what they euphemistically called monthly stains. But these cleaning methods involved harsh loose solutions that often damaged expensive fabrics beyond repair. Catherine de Medicis accounts show enormous expenses for replacing bed linens, cushions, and even throne covers that had been permanently stained during her menstrual cycles. The French court actually budgeted for monthly fabric replacement costs because the staining was so extensive and the cleaning method so destructive. The smell situation was unimaginable. Unwashed menstrual rags combined with the already horrific palace odor. Wividiscode created an olfactory assault that was described by contemporary accounts as the scent of death itself. During royal women's periods, entire sections of palaces would become uninhabitable due to the overwhelming but perhaps the most tragic aspect was how menstruation affected royal women's self-perception and mental health. They genuinely believed they were cursed, contaminated, and dangerous to others during their cycles. This monthly shame and isolation for decades of their lives contributed to severe psychological trauma that affected their ability to rule effectively. Anne of Cleves wrote in her private diary about the monthly curse that makes me unworthy of God's love and man's respect. She described feeling like a diseased animal during her periods and had severe depression that court physicians attributed to her corrupted female nature rather than the horrific conditions she was forced to endure. The practical challenges were equally overwhelming. Royal women wearing gelabort gowns with multiple layers couldn't easily access or change their makeshift menstrual protection. They would often go entire days with saturated, uncomfortable clouts because changing them required the assistance of multiple servants and could take over an hour to accomplish properly. The French court developed elaborate protocols for monthly assistance that required teams of specially trained servants who were considered permanently contaminated by their exposure to menstrual blood. These servants were paid extra wages but were socially ostracized and forbidden from working in other areas of the palace because they were considered spiritually tainted. Royal dining during menstruation was its own nightmare. Women couldn't cook food, serve meals, or even eat at the same table as men during their cycles because their touch was belliveto, spoil food, and contaminate others. They would eat alone, served by their contaminated servants, often surviving gun bread and water because elaborate meal preparation was considered too dangerous. The international limiclics were staggering. Royal marriages were often delayed because brides couldn't travel during their periods. The journey was considered too dangerous for contaminated women. Foreign princesses would sometimes wait months for safe travel windows, causing diplomatic tensions between kingdoms. But the most shocking discovery came from examining the mortality rates of royal women. Modern analysis of historical record shows that royal women had significantly higher rates of reproductive health problems, infections, and early death compared to common women who had access to basic washing facilities and clean rags for menstrual care. The irony is heartbreaking. These women had access to unlimited wealth, the finest medical care available, and armies of servants, yet they suffered through their most basic biological functions in conditions worse than medieval peasants. Because while poor women might use simple clean rags and wash them in rivers, royal women were trapped by religious taboos and medical misinformation that made their monthly cycles into prolonged orals of shame, isolation, and insanitary suffering. Yet, even as these queens endured monthly cycles of humiliation and discomfort, there was an aspect of royal female life that was even more dangerous and disgusting. The process of bringing new life into the world, because royal childbirth practices were so barbaric and unsanitary that they turned what should have been joyful occasions into scenes of medieval horror. When royal women gave birth, they entered what can only be described as a medieval chamber of horrors disguised as a celebration of new life. The childbirth practices in royal courts were so unsanitary and dangerous that they killed more queens than war, diseases, and political assassinations combined. We're talking about delivery procedures that would horrify a modern veterinarian. Royal birthing chambers were sealed environments where no fresh air was allowed to enter, because court physicians believed that outside air would contaminate the birth process. These rooms were kept deliberately hot and stuffy, with heavy tapestries covering every window and door. The lack of ventilation combined with the presence of dozens of unwashed attendants created breeding grounds for deadly bacteria that modern science recognizes as the perfect storm for infection. Jane Seymour, Henry VII's third wife, died 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward V, almost certainly from what we now know as purple sepsis. an infection caused by the horrifically unsanitary conditions in her birthing chamber. The official court records describe her delivery as taking place in a room where no glancing breeze was permitted to disturb the sacred process, meaning she gave birth in a sealed bacterial-laden environment. But the unsanitary conditions were just the beginning of the horror. Royal women were attended by midwives and physicians who never washed their hands, used unsterilized instruments, and often went directly from handling corpses to delivering babies. These medical attendants would examine multiple women in labor, using same unwashed hands and contaminated tools, spreading deadly infections from one royal birth to another. The most shocking example is Dr. Ignace Semmel's research at Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, where he discovered that the ward attended by doctors had a maternal mortality rate of 18%, while the ward attended by midwives had a rate of only 2%. The difference: the doctors were coming directly from autopsy rooms to delivery chambers without washing their hands, literally carrying death from corpses to newborn babies. Royal birthing practices included what they called opening the matrix, a procedure where physicians would manually examine a cervix with unwashed hands, often introducing deadly bacteria directly.